Rakers, a science fiction action adventure. Part 4, Beyond the Veil. Chapter 31. The Grove. There wasn't a reference Fade had to help him understand where he now stood. An icicle, he supposed, might be close, though he'd never been inside one of those before. The room's four walls shimmered as light, which appeared to come from the floor and ceiling in soft yellow glows, warped its way around. At the touch of his feet, the ground burst into colors that fled away from his weight like sparks from a fire. Bits of oranges, greens, and blues bursting out. They mingled with the changing colors of the surface to create an impression that Fade had fallen into a painting while the painter's brush still stroked. Eve watched him like a parent studying a child attempting to walk for the first time. Hopeful, ready to intercede. "Where are we?" Fade asked, because to say anything else seemed ridiculous. "We call it the Grove," Eve replied. "It is, more than any other place, my home. I've never seen anything like this." "You'll get tired of saying that." Eve strode to the far wall, prisms spreading at her feet, and touched her hand to a section that appeared brighter than the rest, as though backlit by a candle. When her hand pressed to the surface, again the color shot out. Only this time the motes of light raced out several feet around her hand, some to the base of the wall, others closer to the ceiling. There they formed a solid chromatic line, and inside of it, the wall faded away. "You might be right," Fade muttered as Eve went through the door. He followed, seeing at first what looked like a stone path and a railing, but one that turned into a balcony as Fade left the room. No, a ring. A giant ring around an opening that must have been as wide as a stadium. Perhaps more. Fade went up to the silver railing, joined Eve, and looked at the many stories above and below, all of them looking identical. Silver railings and stone balconies circling the open center. Behind the railings, Fade could see the outlines, carved into the snowy white stone, of other doors. Far below, at the base of the tower, sat what appeared to be an indigo pool, with a continual ripple emanating from the center. He raised his eyes, then caught something flash by in front of him. Something falling. A body. Fade leaned over the railing, looked down to see what looked like a black and brown creature, mostly a blur at this distance, appear to strike the pool. "Did that thing just—" Fade started. "Watch!" Fade did, and the creature, whatever it was, rose from the water and left. Moved out of Fade's view. It had fallen at least 20 stories from what Fade could count, yet had walked away without an issue. "I don't understand?" "Another thing you'll tire of." Eve smiled at him. "I thought the same thing when I first came here. The Grove is a wonder, Fade, a place so apart from what you know and believe that you will feel as though you've entered a fairy tale. In fact, it might be easier if you think of this like Alice in her rabbit hole." Fade was about to say something when Eve grabbed him by the shoulder and threw him over the edge. He'd fallen before, only not from heights like this. Fade knew he was screaming, saw the world blur at the edges of his vision. He locked on that bright blue pool of water and decided, as last sights go, it wasn't all that bad. Closed his eyes as it came rushing up to greet him. Felt a wispy splash of water on his face. "Come on, let's go!" Eve's voice had Fade open his eyes. He was floating, on his chest, an inch or two above the ripples. His legs and arms felt loose, adrift. "Pretend you're lying on a bed. Turn yourself over and stand up." Everything Fade knew about the requirements of force, namely that to move oneself one had to have something to press against, protested at the idea of rolling in air, of sitting up. Yet when Fade pressed his left shoulder into where, going by Eve's analogy, the mattress would be, he felt firm resistance. Pushed on it, and a moment later stood up and looked right into Eve's appraising face. "You catch on quick. That's a good thing." Eve didn't wait for Fade to reply. She led him away from the pool. The tower's ground floor appeared to have only one exit, though the ring around the pool had the usual set of dark outlines indicating doors. Arches, high and covered in weaving symbols that Fade couldn't understand, guided them out. Out into what, though? Fade had no answer. If perhaps someone had taken the stone foundation for a vast square and wiped away all of the buildings covering it, that would have approached what Fade saw. The white stones journeyed off for several hundred yards in every direction, before seeming to end as though cut away by a knife's edge. Beyond the stones shimmered a sky not blue as Earth's, but fluorescent, filmy, with colors spreading across it like flowering blooms. As Fade watched, the colors expanded in patterns until, by some unknown law or force, they suddenly contracted into invisible dots before appearing, beginning again elsewhere. The courtyard, Fade could not think of a better name, though courtyard was about as poor a choice as any, had wonders of its own. Tables, some sitting higher than Fade was tall, littered the space at random. Many of them were occupied by creatures standing, sitting, or even lying down. Fade had seen a fair share of movies, had read books of fantastical tales high and low, and could only agree with Eve's statement about the rabbit hole. Though as he looked across the groupings, he noticed most of the creatures came in pairs or alone. "You call this place the Grove?" Fade asked. Eve had been standing there, patient. "Is it meant to grow things?" "It is a place of preservation," Eve said, "where we, the Rakers, visit, where we stay when we are not working on our worlds." "The Rakers?" Eve reached out, grabbed Fade's arm, and pulled him out of the way of the arches. Lumbering through seconds later came what looked like a large cluster of vines, only in varieties of crimson instead of Earth's green. Rather than actually moving limbs, the vines seemed to grow and wither their way, leaving disintegrating dust behind as it went. "Arlo," Eve said to the plant, because Fade didn't know what else to call it. "A moment." The vines stopped their forward move. Then, their tangled mass quivering, new growth shot their way. Thick cords of red plants swirled through the air toward Fade, and just before hitting him, broke around and planted themselves in the ground. Eventually, the whole mass stood before him. Two thick trunks stuck to the stones, forming an arch. The top center lowered itself to Fade's eyes, and a blossom emerged, came near Fade's face, and then bloomed into a magnificent cascading golden flower. The center, a pastel red, stared right at him. Pollen dust shot out, sprayed into Fade's face. He expected to cough, and his eyes closed. But instead, words came into his head. "Welcome, little one. What is your name?" Fade turned and looked at Eve. "What's going on? Is it talking to me?" Another puff of pollen. Fade felt it hit his neck, cheek. My name in your tongue is Arlo. Do not be so insulting as, new one, not all of us are as patient as I am." "Arlo, you know I was the same when I first came here," Eve said to the plant. To Arlo, "That does not excuse being impolite. Manners, Eve, are the key to civilization." "Manners?" Fade couldn't help himself. "That's the key? What you can achieve with a polite exchange of words can be far greater than the deadliest weapon. If you mean to help your world, then I suggest you hold that lesson dear. Eve, I must be going. There are things I would ask of the gardener." Arlo didn't wait for Eve's response. The flower withered and died away in front of Fade's eyes as the plant grew its way towards the tables, towards the long, tall line that sat behind them. It looked like a wall, though with markings and things on it Fade couldn't make out from here. "Arlo's a bit of a curmudgeon, but it's been a raker for 3,000 years, so it's earned the right," Eve said. "How could I understand it? The words came to me, like a dream or something." "You heard Arlo mention the gardener?" Eve gestured out across the courtyard to the shifting sky beyond. "That's who built this place, who created the Rakers. The gardener isn't its real name, and I don't think it has a gender, but it's what we call it. That doesn't explain how I understood what a plant was saying." Eve put a hand on Fade's shoulder. "From the moment you came here, you've been breathing in what makes it possible to live in the Grove. What makes the Rakers work. Every one of us, no matter our species, gets them inside us somehow. The gardener's seeds, they're called, and they make everything possible." Eve continued as Fade listened. The seeds were inside him, working to adjust and supply oxygen, repair his wounds, and translate things like Arlo's pollen into language Fade could understand. They would be with him forever, even when he returned to Earth. They were how Eve and Lode survived getting shot by Thalia, and how Eve herself had lived already for almost 3 centuries. But we are not immortal. You can't ever forget that, Eve said. A bullet to the head will still kill you. Same with getting run over by a car or drowning in the ocean. Anatole used to tell me about the Rakers that had died believing they were capable of anything. Are you saying I'm a Raker? Not yet. And here Eve looked away. That depends on the gardener. Doesn't it depend on me? Fade said. Do I not get a choice? Not that staying in this crazed world of talking plants and technicolor skies didn't seem appealing, but Fade had a life, a daughter that he already didn't get to see. Jaunting off on orders from some strange creature didn't seem like a move in the right direction. Of course you do. Only if you say no, you die. Chapter 32. The Reason. Eve led Fade towards the tables, towards the swooping, swirling building beyond them. It looked as though someone had taken a line of thread and looped it through itself a dozen times, frozen it into glass and set it down on the stones. At the base, the lines came together to form a knot, a rounded sphere set into the ground that, nonetheless, sat several stories high. So how do I pass the test, seeing as I'm now invested? Fade said as they went past a tall table. Around it were two things that looked almost like metal poles. Fade could see, as they bent over the table, dozens and dozens of tiny limbs reaching out and grabbing what must have been food. Each arm passed each morsel up to the next one until the bites reached the top of the pole, where they were dumped in. You will either succeed or fail according to what the gardener decides, Eve said. Stop. Stop walking right now. Eve, somewhat to Fade's surprise, did. Looked at him. You can't do this. You can't risk my daughter's only parent on the whim of something I don't know or understand. Take me back, now. And what would have happened if we had stayed in that office? Eve replied. What would have happened if they had found us in there? Do you think they would have called the police? Or would they have just shot us once they realized who we were? Eve wasn't done. What I did was get you out. I could have left. Come back to the Grove entirely alone. The reason I'm taking you with me, Fade, is because I think you can be one of us. I believe you will pass the test. I believe you can become a Raker. I believe you can work with Lode and I. Fade had nothing to say to that. Eve was right. He wasn't dead. Whatever this crazy place was, it beat a prison cell. It beat the hot end of a 0-point rifle. When Eve started walking again, Fade fell in line. Any hints? Tips to help me with this gardener? Fade didn't see that many plants given the thing's name. He spotted Arlo at a table to itself. The creature had grown all over it, covering the entire surface in vines. Leaves had sprouted, large and wide, soaking up the light maybe. Be who you really are, Eve said. You aren't the work you do. You aren't the kidnapper, the killer. You are a father, a person who helps his friends. How did you pass it? Because Anatole knew what he was doing. He could tell what I would be, could tell what Lode would be as well. You two aren't exactly alike. Fade made a note to ask who Anatole was later, when his life wasn't on the line. They were approaching the looping building. Only as Fade came closer, he realized that it wasn't truly a building at all. Instead, the only feature of the sphere appeared to be a single window, a hole covered with some form of glass beyond which sat only black. We're better served by different personalities, Eve said. Lode is more capable of certain acts than I am. Which ones? I'm sure you can guess. He pulls the trigger, sometimes too quickly. But yes, I, meanwhile, prefer quieter means. Eve paused again, glanced over at Fade. Do not confuse that for less deadly. Many have, and they paid for it. Sounds like your path to a better future is paid in blood, Fade said. Doesn't seem all that wonderful. Recently, yes, violence has taken a higher place in our methods. Eve looked at the stones for a second. I would prefer the bullet and the knife not be our first choice, which is why you are here. Don't know if you noticed, but I'm not exactly a peaceful guy. But you understand when talking is a better option, Eve said. You demonstrated that when you had us at your house. Two people that had attempted to kill you, that had threatened your daughter, and still you were willing to hear us out. That is when I decided you belonged here. As they came closer, the hole in the center of the sphere began to glow. The black filled in with a slow-growing white, until the two colors were even. Eve held up a hand, and Fade stopped. They watched as the two colors mingled together, and then the colors flowed out through the hole, through the barrier and towards the two of them. As with Arlo and its vines, Fade thought the black and white goo, which swam through the air like water in a tube, would splash right into him. Instead, the stuff poured to the ground, coalesced up and into a tall older man, albeit one whose face seemed to be sliding to the left. The man's skin, clothes, everything was a dark gray, almost metallic. "Eve," the man spoke in a fluted voice like a distorted keyboard. "I trust this is better than last time? Your face is still sliding, Gardner, but the clothes are more refined." Eve gave a slight bow and Fade followed suit. If this was the thing that he had to impress, pride could take a back seat. Getting out of here and back to JC was the important thing. "Specific features are so difficult," the gardener said. "Did you know when Anatole first suggested the idea, I had been coming to him as a cube for hundreds of years?" "This is far better, Gardner," Eve replied. "For one, I can actually see your mouth move. I can't imagine how strange it would seem to have a voice emerge from nothing. Far stranger things in this universe, Eve. Far stranger." The gardener shifted his eyes to Fade. "And this is your new arrival, the one you would have me test. Fade Vance." Fade held out his hand. "But you can call me Fade." The gardener looked at Fade's hand, didn't move an arm. "I assume you've learned some about what this place is and why you are here?" Eve's mentioned a thing or three. "I want to say, though, that I have a daughter, that you take that into account when you do your test, whatever that is." The gardener nodded. Fade felt a pull on his leg and looked down. The same dark liquid that made up the gardener appeared to be seeping up through the stones, wrapping itself around his legs, climbing up towards his stomach. Fade tried to move, but it was as though his legs were gone. Weren't listening. "Eve?" Fade looked over at her. She watched him, silent. He noticed the tables near him were staring too. A collection of horrors and things unimaginable looking on as his body disappeared into the goo. "What's happening, Eve?" She didn't answer. The gray consumed him. Chapter 33. Duel. JC shot up in the bed. There'd been a noise, loud, close. Also, where was she? The light ghosting in from outside the window wasn't familiar. An air conditioner hummed, then cut off. The banging came again. The door. JC blinked, looked to her right, saw a blaring red digital clock declare it nearly 3 in the morning. Right. She was in a hotel. Her house was a crime scene, and she still wore her street clothes. In her bed next to her sat her backpack, along with a couple of books from school. She'd actually passed out doing homework, waiting for her dad. Not for the first time. A third set of knocks, louder. That might be Fade now, trying to be let in. JC flipped on the lamp and slipped out of the bed, padded along the carpet over to the door, tried to shake the cobwebs from her mind, pressed on the handle and pulled the door open. It lurched to a stop an inch later, the chain up top. She forgot to remove it. Her eyes were blurry, still waking up. But she recognized the wide-brimmed hat, the scruffy neck, the glowering face. "Where's my father?" JC didn't undo the chain. This guy hadn't been a friend. "He's with Eve," Lode replied, "checking in on Talia." "Then why are you here?" Lode looked up and down the hallway. "To keep you safe. After they find Talia, they're going to see about the firm that attacked your house this afternoon. I'm here to make sure they don't get you first." JC paused. Why would Eve leave, only to send Lode back? Hadn't Lode been taken by whomever raided their house in the first place? "I don't understand," JC said. "How'd you escape?" They didn't know what they were dealing with. Before JC could make another move, Lode stepped into the door, pressed his shoulder against it and forced the metal chain out from the wall. It popped off with a snap. Lode stepped inside the room and slammed the door shut behind him. JC backed away. "You didn't have to do that. You weren't moving quick enough. Too vulnerable out there." Load surveyed the room. Decent place you have here. JC retreated further. Past the TV on her right, remembered what sat under the screen. Load's gun, the pistol, looking conspicuously silver next to the jet black television. She felt his eyes on her, felt his stare slide to the gun. Thanks for watching it for me, Load said. He walked towards it. JC darted first, grabbed the pistol and lifted it, pointed it at Load, finger on the trigger. How did you get free? JC said. Load stopped, glared at her. I've got a mean right hook. That's all it took, huh? JC said. Guys with rifles and you punched your way out? I'm pretty good at it. Load reached up, took off his hat, and tossed it on the bed next to Jamie's school stuff. Stretched his hands out in front of his chest, threw up a lopsided smile. How about you give me back my gun? You answer me first. Who are you? What do you want with my father? JC, it's way too early to be having this conversation. All you need to worry about is how you're going to get out of this alive. That sounded different. JC felt the same surge of fear that crashed over her when the bullets came through the window, when she opened the door to see Load's gun in her face. This guy, this cowboy, he wasn't her friend. He wasn't here to protect her. Yeah, see, I'm going to need you to leave, JC said. The door had a deadbolt, another lock. She could put a chair against it and call the police. Load wouldn't want that attention. Or what? Load said. A girl like you? You're not used to this world. You're soft. You know what we used to do when a man walked in holding a gun he didn't know how to use? JC shook her head, backed up another step. She bumped into the air conditioner, built into the wall behind her. Load shifted closer, his hands dropping to his sides. Only the width of the second bed between them now. We bought him a drink, whatever whiskey was left. Then we take him outside, set them 3 paces away, tell them to shoot us. Know what happened? JC shook her head again. She wanted to speak, wanted to think of some plan, but there was nothing except the cowboy's story going into her head. Some of them were such cowards they wouldn't even raise their gun. Some at least pulled the trigger. But see, they didn't know what they were doing. They'd miss, shoot the dirt or the air. Too afraid to point it at a man. Then it was our turn. We didn't miss. I don't have any whiskey, JC replied. The only thing she could think of to say. Well, that's a damn shame. Seeing as you're looking tired, though, I'm feeling it's about the same. So how about it, JC? You know how to use that thing? JC looked down at her hands. The gun seemed so large, long, silver, inscribed with all manner of sigils and symbols. More like a work of art than a weapon. But it was loaded. It was cocked and ready. So she raised it and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the room. JC closed her eyes as it went off. Opened them after, her ears ringing. The gun still barely in her grip after the recoil. Load was looking to his right, at a hole in the wall over his shoulder. See what I mean? Scared ones always miss. My turn. Load drew his gun, pulled the trigger, shot JC in the chest. It felt like a punch followed by the worst pain JC had ever felt. A strange cold agony bursting through her. All she could think to do was stumble forward. Fall towards the very man who'd taken her life. He caught her, held her close as he pulled his gun from her right hand. JC's left hand fell into his jacket, into his pocket as her mouth blubbered. Her eyes teared, and the world swam in black. Her fingers fell around something smooth, round, a stone. Don't you go staining my shirt, Load was saying. I'd hate to have to find a new one. Load pushed JC away, but she kept her hand on that stone. It seemed like the only thing that was real, the only thing left. Hey, she heard Load say, his voice rising. You give that here. JC hit the ground, the carpet thin and scratchy. She looked over at the stone. It was red. No, that was her blood. Sticky and wet. She wiped her thumb against it. Green. So green. She held it tight, and everything vanished away. Chapter 34. Problem progress. Before him was a lever. 2 options, right and left. On Fade's left was a track, a path that stood light gray against the black backdrop, a dark that seemed to be everywhere the path wasn't. Behind the lever, in the near distance, the path forked, with one leading far off to the right. Fade reached out and touched the lever, cold and stiff, but he thought he could move it. "Hello," a child's voice. A young boy stood on the nearby part of the path, 5 years old, perhaps less. He had a cheery smile on his face, wore a uniform as if he were going to a school. "What's your name?" Fade told him, and the child clapped, as though Fade's name was the most brilliant thing in the world. Fade asked the same question of the child, and the boy replied that he didn't know his name, that he'd forgotten it. That seemed odd. Who forgot their own name? Before Fade could figure that out, noises drew his attention away from the boy. On the other path, on his right side and many yards away, stood a gathering of people, all sizes and shapes, but they were indistinct, their faces hidden by hats, thick coats, or simply difficult to make out in the dark. They were calling to him, frantic, but Fade couldn't understand the words. Too far away. "Do you know what I want to be when I grow up?" the boy asked him. "Tell me," Fade said, but he kept his eyes on the far crowd. What were they saying? "An inventor," the boy shouted the word. "I want to make all the problems disappear." "Well, that's a good dream to have," Fade replied. Then he saw a spark, a light behind the lever, growing larger, right in the center of the path and coming towards him. "Do you know what that is?" the boy asked, and Fade saw him point towards the light. "Because I do." "What is it?" "A choice, Mr. Fade. You've got to pick. The choice is there in front of you." Fade looked at the simple lever, left and right. Behind the light, a steady roar built, a gradual grinding and gnashing of gears. The people on the faraway path were yelling more now. Their arms waved wildly. "Can you get off of the path?" Fade asked the boy. "And go where?" the boy said. "This path is the only home I have." The roaring grew louder and louder. One small boy, one crowd of faceless people. "You have to choose, mister." Fade turned and reached for the boy. He'd grab the kid off of the path, get him out of the way, and send the train that direction. Except when he reached towards the kid, the boy stepped back, shook his head. "That's not how it works." The boy sounded sad this time. "You can't have it both ways." Fade stared at the child. This was a test, of course. With one right answer. He pushed the lever to the left. "I understand, mister." The boy gave him a smile, even as tears leaked from his eyes and ran down his face. "Sorry, kid," Fade said, and he was. Even if this was a test, a moment later the bright white glow fell over Fade, and as the roar drowned out everything else, the scene melted away. He was back on the white stones, back in front of the metallic man, the gardener. Eve and the other aliens still staring at him. "Did I pass?" Fade said, as the gray ran away from him, seeped back into the ground. "What do you think the test was?" the gardener replied. "Choose to save the many at the expense of the few," Fade said. "I get it." "Wrong." The gardener looked at Eve. "You brought him to me before he was ready, before he understood." Eve glared back at the gardener. "I didn't have a choice. He would have died otherwise. I had to give him a chance." "I failed? What?" Fade felt the dual shocks of failure and surprise flood his nerves. Eve had said the consequence for failure was death. But how had he failed? It had seemed so obvious. "The mission of the Rakers," the gardener said to Fade, "is to preserve the forward progress of a civilization. That may require preserving the brightest luminaries at the expense of innocence." "Well, that sounds evil," Fade crossed his arms. "Depending on your point of view, it may well be," the gardener said. "However, you will find that the general course of your work as a raker will have you doing the most good." Fade caught a couple of the words. "Wait, my work as a raker? I thought I failed." "You may not have understood the meaning of the test, but you succeeded regardless," the gardener said. "The goal, Fade, is to see if you can properly evaluate which action to take and to have the proper reasons for taking that action. In this, while you sacrificed the child, you had defensible reasons for doing so, given the state of your knowledge. I accept this. Fade didn't know what to say. His mind had been scrambled, and he didn't like it. But before he could speak, the gardener seemed to disintegrate, fall apart into the black and white swirl and suck back into the dark hole in the looping building. Gone. Come on, Eve said, though Fade caught the smile on her face. We've got to see the audience now. And go home? Fade didn't know what the audience was, but at this point, all he wanted was to get back to the familiar, to find his daughter and a stiff drink. And go home. Chapter 35. The Lost Man. Veronica had never seen her father this angry before. Christopher stomped back and forth in his office. She was the only one in there, and she felt afraid. Not that he had ever hit her, threatened her, ever disciplined with more than the usual gruff attitude of a disappointed parent. But she had failed him. She'd let load get away. You have to understand, Veronica. We aren't playing games here. This isn't your action movie adventure. What that man had was priceless. He had a key to something greater than all of us. Christopher leaned over his desk. It was almost 4 in the morning, well past either of their bedtimes. But Veronica knew he wasn't going to sleep, and she wouldn't either. Because for the first time, as scary as it was, as strange as this had all become, she was in it. After spending all of her teenage years on the outside, barely aware of what her father was doing on a day-to-day basis, now Veronica was involved. Implicated. She had evidence and the power not to use it. Now she was part of her father's family. A key to what? Veronica asked. She sat forward in a skeleton chair, a pair of thin cushions on the bottom and back. Even her dad's chair seemed hard. Part of his philosophy, a lack of comfort keeps you moving, keeps you from being lazy. The rest of the office stood sparse. Only 3 token gestures. A painting that looked like a window onto the seashore from their house. A photograph of Veronica, of her mother, and that was it. The key to what? I don't know. I don't have the answer. The admission seemed to frustrate Christopher. Understand, Veronica, we don't have the answers, but we have the key, the way in. Now I need to know how to use it. I had hoped a second one, along with the man himself, would provide the answer. How do you know it's a key? Her father turned to her, shut his eyes for a minute, then pressed a button on his desk. Coffee, please. We'll need some in here. Christopher walked over to the side wall, an empty white, across from another blank section. Pressed in on the wall, and it appeared to recede. Slid up to reveal a projector, one that powered up and shot across the room, coating the far wall in an image of his computer's desktop. Bring up the Lost Man slides, her father announced, his voice less conversational, as though talking to a robot. The desktop shimmered and then launched a different program. A slideshow. The first one held a body, lying there in the jungle brush. Veronica could see vines all around, sunlight pouring through. Wherever this was, it would have been hot. Tropical. We called him the Lost Man, her father said. We'd been tracking him for a long time. He would appear in cities across the world, usually around major events, sometimes with assassinations, kidnappings, or major swings in markets. So, Veronica said, who was he? He had 100 names, passports and identities, knowledge of languages not spoken anymore, her father said. We finally caught up with him, nailed him in Vietnam, or rather, the Vietnamese did. Turned out he wasn't quite as good at getting through the jungle as they were. They didn't leave anything to chance. So you're saying this guy died in Vietnam, and now he's your big answer? Veronica, her father clicked forward. The next image was a scatter shot of his possessions, all of them laid out against a white space. We paid for these. You should know. The coats and pants were normal, the watch standard. But we'd never seen anything like this before. The slide advanced again, a small green brooch, like what she'd seen Lode grab with his clothes. We call it the badge. It's the key. We found it with a bunch of other things that went back centuries. Artifacts carried on his person that had no reason to be there. Old coins. Even a signed thank you note from Lincoln. A signed note from Lincoln? As in Abraham? Our lost man went everywhere. Her father rubbed his eyes. We took what we found and used it to crack into his other identities. Found financial records and histories going back decade after decade. He was everyone and no one. But he lived for a long time. That was certain. Lived without getting one day older. And of all the things he owned, the only one that doesn't make sense is that green jewel there. So what are you saying? Veronica said. That this guy could live forever? Christopher nodded. We think so, but we can't figure it out. But father, you said you found him in Vietnam. You're not that old. Oh, I didn't find him. My father did. He spent his life building this company, ruining this company, trying to crack the badge. I went about it a different way, used the foundation your grandfather had started to make our money, and now we have the resources to find the secret that my father couldn't unlock. The door opened. A man stood there with the coffee and a phone. Who is it? It's that one who was just here. The cowboy? He wants the badge. Her dad looked back to Veronica, smiled. Looks like it's your lucky day, Veronica. The rabbit came back to the fox. Chapter 36. Table target. As they walked towards the tower, Eve went to the side and found an empty table, roughly their height. Sit down, Eve said, pointing. Fade had noticed the chairs change from one table to the next, designed, apparently, for different species. If you're wondering, this is our table. Every species has their own. Some of them mix. Fade nodded at a larger table surrounded by 3 pairs. 2 creatures that looked more like floating collections of dust than anything. Twin, lanky, moss-covered insect things, and what Fade could only call slugs. Yellow, translucent, and sweating puddles on the stones at their feet. We do talk to each other, you know. Have friends. You met Arlo. It seemed real friendly. Here, eat something. Eve slipped into her seat and pressed her hand onto the table. The surface glowed a light green beneath her fingers, colors bursting like the floors in the tower. Put your hand on the table. Fade copied Eve's movement, watched the colors leak out from his own fingers. They coalesced several inches in front of his hand, and a moment later a square section of the table in front of him sank down and slid to the side. From the hole, a tan, wood-like slab rose with a variety of things Fade had never seen before. A deep green pudding, what looked to be a white set of noodles clustered with various bits of fried something, a small glass like a sake-style cup on the left side full of what looked like tea. A fork, knife, and spoon sat at the bottom of the slab, stacked next to each other on their sides. It's targeted to your deficiencies, Eve said as she bent towards her own meal. My deficiencies? The same seeds that help keep you alive tell the table what your body needs. The gardener's resources then supply it. You'll be perfectly satisfied. How does it taste? Fade thought about asking that, but held back. Took a hold of the silverware and cut himself some of the noodles. Took a tentative bite. They were starchy, dry, but each of the chips had a burst of juicy flavor that made Fade think of the fruit-filled pastries he'd had as a child. The pudding went down like a vegetable smoothie, though one with enough of a chilled aftertaste to cleanse any bitterness. The tea was, well, tea, black and stiff, refreshing. Your overlord makes a good meal. Fade pointed at his empty plate with the knife. Where does it all come from? We could spend hours talking about how the gardener made this place, Eve replied. And we will after we get you back to JC. How do we do that? We ask the audience, Eve said. She placed her hand on the table again, though instead of pressing her whole palm against the surface, she only set down her thumb. The slabs with their plates on them started to drop away. Fade quickly added his fork and knife to the vanishing tray and then stared at the table. Because it wasn't a table anymore, the gray-blue stone had faded away, turned into a map, an image of what Fade knew was the Milky Way galaxy. That's a neat effect, Fade said. Only the beginning, Eve replied. Audience, how are you today? Very well, Eve, the table announced. As it spoke, though Fade could not see any speakers, the edges of the table, now showing the dark of space, emitted teal waves with every syllable. Though I am afraid you may not like what I have to say. Eve sat back from the table. Fade caught her frown. Not what she'd expected then. "It appears Lode is not with you?" the audience asked Eve. "He's on Earth." "Perhaps that is for the best." The table shifted its display from the galaxy to, with a rapid zoom in, a series of planets. Fade recognized the solar system and hung with the shift a moment later when the audience narrowed the focus to Earth. Then it went closer, to the city Fade called home and the coastal hills and mountains around it. Currently, Lode himself is the target. The new target. Fade had been the target once before. That's why Eve and Lode had shown up at the dock the first time around. But Lode was on their side, right? Why would they bother targeting one of their own? Eve, for her part, rubbed her temples with her hand. "We both knew this could happen." "A risk we accepted, given his effectiveness," the audience replied. "However, he has now outlived his usefulness. Left unchecked, Lode could alone alter humanity's trajectory. He must be dealt with." "Dealt with?" Fade asked. "It's gray for a reason," Eve said. "Lode always went for the kill, claimed it was cleaner that way. But just killing someone often creates more problems than it solves. You don't need to kill a target. We didn't kill you. So what else can you do?" "The targets are chosen based on the risk they present," the audience said. "Imagine every person on your world is a string, vibrating in harmony. Some, however, begin to shake more violently than others, threaten to snap. The reasons for such variance are many, as are the solutions. You can cut the string, at risk of its absence disrupting the music, or you can attempt to soothe it, calm its motion, and return it to the symphony." "Something changed about you, Fade," Eve said. "Your priorities, maybe, your attitude. Whatever it was, according to the audience, you're no longer the problem." "Well, that's a relief." "Yes, in a way." Eve stood. "Audience, is Lode still in the city?" On the table, a red dot appeared, north of the city in the mountains. Several green dots joined it, scattered throughout the region. Eve reached out and touched one near the shore of the large lake just inside the coast. One surrounded by the city. "What are you doing?" "Lode's current location is that red dot. I'll be able to track him once we go back, now that the audience is tuned to it," Eve said, though her voice was distracted. Before, she'd been focused on teaching Fade, helping him understand where they were. Now Fade saw she'd moved on to other things. The green shows where we can go back to. Places, audience, set the door. Eve pushed away from the table and once more started walking towards the looping structure with the black hole in the middle. As Fade watched, the landscape faded from the table, and in a second, the entire display had returned to the blue-gray stone from before. "Wait, how?" Fade asked as he caught up to Eve. "How are we getting back?" As they approached the large sphere where, not long ago, the gardener had emerged, the black shifted again. Instead of turning white, instead of reaching out, the glass-looking barrier in front of the orb sank down into a slot in the stone. The sphere itself tilted, lowering the edge of the opening to the ground, a ramp they could walk up. "When the gardener finds a new civilization to monitor," Eve said without stopping, "he scatters seeds across its surface. They are beacons, like badges that the audience can tie into. This device, the door, sends us to them. The badges, smaller versions, bring us back." Fade stepped on the slanted surface, looked into the black hole. Only it wasn't black anymore. Rather, muddy swirls of blues and greens filtered through the space, like viewing a picture through a thick haze. Eve, a foot ahead of Fade, turned back to him. "When you go through, hold your breath." Eve took another step and vanished. Fade gave one last look back across the tables, the strange alien creatures in the tower back behind them. He didn't know what was on the other side of that door, but staying here wouldn't get him to his daughter. So Fade took one long stride, one deep breath, and disappeared. Chapter 37. Colors and Creatures. If there were dreams, she didn't remember them. If there were nightmares, she didn't experience them. From one moment to the next, JC's eyes were closed, and then they were open again. Only her body had changed. She'd been in pain, bleeding onto the hotel floor. Now she didn't know where she was. The walls around her shimmered. the ceiling above a cascade of color, overwhelming almost, and she felt no pain. Nothing really, except a vague desire for food and the mental fog that comes from waking up. Was this heaven? Some other religion's afterlife? JC moved her hands to sit up and heard something hit the ground. The jewel, green and shiny against the floor. As she stood up, JC felt her shirt sticking to her, looked down at it and saw the wide red stain. Not a dream. She moved her hand over her mouth, closed her eyes, and breathed. Just breathed. Not a dream. Think, JC. She pulled her hand away, swallowed, bent down and picked up the jewel. Her clothes, black leggings and the white shirt didn't have pockets, so she'd have to hold it. Where was she? JC took a step into the center of the room. Eyes went wide at the sparkling blues popping forth from her white socks. The colored dots raced around the floor, bounced along the walls, wound up collecting along one side where JC noticed the wall itself seemed to be darker. Don't remember this in any religion, JC said. The sound of her own voice was a relief in itself. She could still talk, could still hear. Basic science told her that if she could speak, could hear, then there had to be air for the sound to travel through, which meant either she was in a place that defied physical laws entirely, or somehow she'd been taken away from that hotel to somewhere else. Load might have carried her here. The thought had JC freeze. Listen. But the room was silent. She took another step, towards the dark section of the wall. Green sparks this time, flying around and joining their blue brothers. Building an outline, an archway. No, a door. 3 more steps, and JC stood in front of a rainbow silhouette that resembled any of 1,000 doors she'd seen before. Except this one didn't seem to have a handle. Let's hope you're not a pull. JC reached out and placed her right hand, holding the jewel in her left, on the chromatic door. Right where the knob would be, pushed, the door swung open on hinges JC couldn't see. On the other side sat a thick silver rail above a translucent fence. Symbols and images JC couldn't identify were carved into it, murals that held no meaning for her. She walked out of the room and saw the white stone balcony wrap around the level. A blue pool of rippling water lay far, far below. What? JC mouthed the word, looking all around. None of this made any sense. Behind her, the door swung shut with a soft thud. No handle on this side either. Guess she wouldn't be getting back into that room. A new noise drew her attention to the railing. On the other side, another door was opening. JC dropped to a crouch, peeked through the gap between the carvings and the railing itself. If Load was coming to check on her, she might be able to avoid him. Hide. What came out of that door, though, wasn't the cowboy. Wasn't, in fact, something she could name. It resembled a spider, sort of, but one made of glass. It had so many limbs, and all of them flared in the light coming down through the open top of the tower. JC wanted to stand, wanted to get a better look at it, except then it would get a look at her. So she stayed down, watched the creature approach the railing, and then it flashed, bright, disappeared. JC stood up. Where had it gone? I haven't seen you here before? The voice came from beside her, a glistening sound like fine sand falling onto the floor. JC jumped, spun away, and looked directly at the creature she'd seen a second ago by the door. Are you a new Raker, from Earth? JC turned to run, took one step, and then the creature was in front of her again. Up close she could see the thing's body. It was small, a black, no dark blue central pod, with limbs going off in all directions, thin, almost like strings. They appeared to be woven through what looked like glass, or some sort of shiny rock. No need to be afraid, new one. We are all friends here. We all serve the gardener. The creature, when it spoke, rubbed its limbs together. The sound, JC realized, came not from a mouth or other thing, but the scratching of the rocks against each other. How she understood it, JC didn't know. But there it was, in her ears, in perfect English. I don't know where I am? The creature stood up straighter on its glass-tinged limbs. As terror faded, JC figured the thing would have sliced her up by now if it was going to. JC took a closer look. Notice that, tangled around one of the creature's legs, was a brooch similar to the one she now grasped in her hand. "You are in the grove, miss. I am Sassix, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to this miraculous place." Chapter 38. Across Time and Space. Veronica had never seen two men go at it like Lode and her father. They had been fighting back and forth in Christopher's office for the last hour as the sun rose outside the windows. Over and over again about who deserved what property was whose, and honestly, Veronica had tuned them out. The dilemma, Christopher had been arguing, was that they had only one badge now. Christopher didn't want to let the cowboy go without him. Lode might just run off, but they couldn't get the badge to work without Lode's help, so they were stuck. Until Lode jabbed his finger towards Veronica and said, "I'll take her with me." "What?" both Veronica and her father said at the same time. "I don't trust you." Lode pointed at Veronica's father. "She isn't a threat. Your daughter doesn't have an agenda. So let me take her. She'll tell you what's on the other side, what you think the badge is a key for." "Veronica?" Christopher looked at his daughter, at once hopeful and annoyed. Veronica met his stare. "You hear what he said?" "I heard it." "The thing I don't understand," Christopher said, turning back to Lode, "how can I trust you won't kill her or abandon her somewhere?" "You can't. The only thing you have to go on is faith. The fact that I didn't kill any of your men on the way out of this place. The fact that I didn't kill any men on the way in." Lode tilted his head towards Veronica. "You can ask her. I didn't hurt anyone I didn't need to, because that's not my job." "What is your job?" "My job is to keep you people alive. Keep humanity going the right way. You sure aren't helping?" "I don't understand," Christopher said, "but I'll make you a deal. You come back with my daughter alive, and I'll help you get Fade." They stared at each other for a breath. Lode stuck out his hand. Veronica's father shook it, called for someone to go get the badge. A few minutes later, the green badge sat on the table in front of them, the jewel wrapped in gold. Lode looked at Veronica. "Now you want to hang on to my hand. You blink, and you're going to be somewhere else. Don't panic, stay quiet, and listen to me." "Veronica," Christopher said, "memorize everything. I want a full report, everything you see, hear, feel, and experience. All of it." "I'll do what I can," Veronica said. "You'll have to live with the results." Lode laughed, held out his hand. Was she really going to jump in with this guy? Who'd kept her hostage not long ago? Though what were her options? Say no and run? This was her first chance to be a part of her father's secret. She wasn't going to back out now, so she reached out, took hold of Lode's hand, and watched as he grabbed the badge. For a brief instant, there was a flash, a sensation of shifting at high speed, and then there was nothing. After the first 5 minutes and that fall off the balcony into the water, Veronica felt she had a handle on it. Lode spewed one detail after another at her. They walked out into the stone courtyard, underneath the shifting sky, and Veronica tried to pay attention to what Lode was saying about something called Rakers, some sort of band dedicated to keeping humanity from falling apart. Maybe other worlds too, going by the strange array of things that assaulted her eyes and imagination. The grove felt like a bad version of Halloween, where the costumes were too strange to be scary and too real to be funny. The lack of candy didn't help matters. All the things here, these were what Christopher would like to see. Creatures and creations everywhere, floating through the air, stomping around her, legs like giant tree trunks. It was mind-tearing. Too much. The kind of thing that Veronica should have been scared of, except that she'd spent most of the last 2 days held at some degree of gunpoint. And once she'd resigned herself to die, there wasn't much left to be scared of. They went towards a large orb into which a series of what seemed like metal bands looped. As they came up to the orb, a pair of creatures Veronica couldn't describe if she'd wanted to vanish into it. The structure tilted away, a glass plate rose up in front of it, and the colors faded to pure black. Her father would be excited by all of this, as futuristic, as strange as he could want. "If there was a person I did not expect to see here, it would be you." The rasping voice came from behind them. Veronica turned and saw what looked like a large spider, gray blocks etched into its many, many legs, like a spider broken out of wet concrete. "You are a wanted man, Lode Ralston." Veronica's jaw didn't drop till she saw Lode give the creature a bow. "You're looking interesting today, gardener," Lode said as he straightened. "Who's wanting me?" "The audience has marked you. It would seem your methods have finally reached their inevitable end." The gardener loomed larger. Veronica wasn't sure how, but the creature grew taller. Its claws became more menacing. "My methods are what's keeping Earth spinning," Lode replied. "I'm looking for a girl. Human. She would have come in a couple of hours back. She has my badge." "I have found your human girl," the gardener said, and then it pointed at Veronica. "There." "He's not talking about me," Veronica replied. "Stay quiet," Lode snapped at her. Then to the creature, who seemed to regard the two of them with bland annoyance, Lode continued, "She'd look different, a little younger, more scared likely." "How did this girl acquire your badge? You are a raker, are you not?" "Accidents happen, even to us. I can't draw aces all of the time." The gardener curled one of its legs behind itself, pulled out a badge. The green jewel glittered in the bright light. Veronica wouldn't have minded wearing the stone, would have worked quite well with a number of outfits. Except, of course, for its propensity to warp its wearer away from the party entirely. Like Bilbo and his ring, only a little more drastic. "Is this what you are searching for?" The gardener held the badge out to Lode, who took it, looked at it closely, then stuffed it into his jacket pocket. "That'd be the one." "Then know that your girl has been dealt with." The gardener began to shrink down as though it was melting into the stones. "I suggest you see the audience. Learn how you can atone for your mistakes, how you can remove yourself from your unfortunate position." Then it was gone, seeped away into the stones. "What the hell was that?" Veronica said. "Not that the rest of this place makes any sense, but still." The gardener made the grove. Lode spoke as he walked away, towards what looked like a slab of a table. "The Rakers are his. If you leave this place, it's because he lets you." "He said you were a marked man?" "We'll be seeing about that right now. If we're lucky, all I'll need to do to clear my name is put a bullet in the right man's skull." Chapter 39. Friendly Spiders. Turned out Sussex wasn't the only raker in the grove from his world. The other two had come earlier, and Sussex, after introducing JC to the gardener, who'd taken her badge, had dragged JC over to their table. The slab sat at the height of JC's eyes, too high for her to do anything with. "Can you lift me up?" JC asked the creature. Sussex had, so far, proved to be a fast-talking tour guide. Every little detail had been explained away. Sussex knew all of the reasons for the tables, knew all of the alien species, and knew that the gardener would be polite to JC precisely because, Sussex said, he was nearly 1,000 Earth years old. How did he know what Earth years were, and how to calculate them in relation to his own time? By asking questions. Sussex had a lot of those. Every moment he wasn't describing something, Sussex had been interrogating JC about her life, her clothes, interests, television, and the internet. Had Sussex been a normal person, JC would have found herself exhausted, but the sheer eagerness with which Sussex took in every comment gave her the boost of being listened to, cared about. "Of course," Sussex replied, and reached down a pair of legs. They closed around JC like especially thin, hard arms going for a hug, and pulled her up. The rest of Sussex stood around her, so that JC felt like she was inside a strange cocoon. From her new vantage point, JC cast her eyes around the courtyard, looked over at the other tables clotted with creatures, at the color bursts in the skies overhead, at the strange sphere from which the gardener had come out to greet her. And she saw Lode, with Veronica, striding down the aisle between the tables. "Bring me down," JC said fast. "Quick!" Sussex complied. "Whatever is the problem? The man who shot me. He's going to the gardener right now." JC felt Sussex twist. "Ah, Lode? He is a raker for your planet. A gruff one, if memory serves." Sussex's fellow rakers clattered their legs in agreement. "You say he shot you?" With what? A pistol. What is that? Not now. JC ducked down below the table and stared through the forest of legs. Lode and Veronica were standing in front of the sphere, talking to the gardener. Lode was a raker. Would that mean the gardener would give her up? Do not be afraid, little one, Sasek said to her. There is no danger here. Not unless the gardener wishes it. Why wouldn't he? JC whispered back, though Lode and Veronica were too far away to hear. Because you are not a threat. The gardener, like all of us, does not believe in violence for the sake of violence. That's why he's got Lode working for him? Sasek didn't have an answer to that. JC didn't care. The gardener had receded into the ground, and now Veronica and Lode were standing over a table. A much more human-sized table. They are talking to the audience now, Sasek said. He'd already explained the audience to JC, the program that tracked targets. That gave the Rakers their next objective. JC had asked Sasek what his own target was, and the explanation had been short and sweet. If you had years, perhaps I could explain our world and its many operations to you, Sasek had said. Since you do not, free yourself of curiosity. You're one to say that. But I have been learning of Earth for centuries. It is like coloring in a part of a painting nearly finished. For you, this would be the first stroke, and now is not the time to draw. Lode and Veronica were leaving, walking back towards the gardener's sphere. Only instead of the gardener coming to greet them, the sphere lowered its front. The black infinite inside that thing spiraled into a mix of greens and blues. Lode pushed Veronica in ahead of him and followed her. The sphere a moment later straightened and the colors faded. Where did they go? JC asked. Back to Earth, Sasek replied. Now let us go see what they were looking at. Before JC could ask what the creature meant, Sasek picked her up and scurried across the courtyard over to the human table. It seemed blank, blue-gray like the others. Place your hand on it. Sasek didn't wait for JC to comply, but moved her arm with his own spindly leg. Set her hand on the tabletop. Sparks, yellow and red, shot from her flat palm and coalesced around the center of the table. Now ask the audience what you want to see. Ask it? Talk to it as though you were talking to me. Talk to the table as though she was talking to an alien spider creature she'd just met after being shot in a hotel by a cowboy hired into immortal servitude by a strange gray metal being that gave out green gems as ways to get home. Right. What was Lode looking at? JC asked the table. Asked the audience. The blue-gray surface shimmered and twisted. Lines broke across the surface, bright and orange. At first, JC thought they would form a grid, but no. They rearranged into a spiderweb-like structure. Dots at intersections, some larger than others. One nearly as big as JC's hand connected to a different, somewhat smaller circle. This is Earth's web, the audience said. JC flinched. The words came from nowhere. No mouth, no visible speaker, but they were there all the same. These connections show the greatest threats to humanity and their ties to one another. The larger the circle, the greater the chance they will drive humanity past a point beyond which it cannot recover. Who is that one? JC pointed to the largest circle. The lines leading from it disappeared and the circle slid to one side of the table, dissolved into Lode's face. Information about the man streamed across the table. Born in 1870 in Wyoming. Family members. Interests. Current location. Occupation. Raker. Lode is currently humanity's greatest living risk, the audience said without affectation. They weren't looking at him, though, were they? JC said. He wouldn't care about himself. Lode's face shifted back to the orange circle. The web reappeared for a moment, and a smaller spark Lode connected to took the cowboy's place on the right side of the table. They wished to know what target would alleviate Lode's status as the most dangerous quantity, the audience said. On the table, grinning face looking up at her, was her father. Chapter 40. Fatherhood. Fade sat on a long collection of smooth rocks on the edge of the lake, soaked from head to toe. He'd been looking for an excuse to get a new phone, and now that water had rendered his into an inert lump of plastic, it would be a perfect time. Eve, still in her athletic wear, stood beside him. Her clothes dried faster in the late morning sun, being made of airy fabric rather than Fade's jeans and cotton. He hadn't actually changed since the fight the day before. Hadn't slept either. The trip to the Grove and back had broken his mind, turned up the adrenaline enough that exhaustion only burned at the edges. But it would come soon. Fade closed his eyes for a moment, felt the breeze and the light. He could drift off right here. No, he had to find JC. That's why we don't put our gadgets in our pockets, Eve was saying. We find ourselves taking baths when we don't want to. Her words cleared away Fade's mental fog. What about the thing you used that knocked me out? Eve reached into her backpack, always had it strapped over her shoulders. Eve pulled out the weapon, which looked like a short tube with a stubby handle on the bottom. My backpack is waterproof, so my things, like this lightning flash, aren't affected by our wet landings. So you could have put my phone in there? It slipped my mind. Eve did look apologetic, so Fade let it slide. What's it do? Fade pointed at the lightning flash. Anatole didn't tell me where the name came from, or the idea for it. The gardener supplied it to us a long time ago, and that's how his words translated. Eve turned the thing in her hands. How I think of it is a camera, but in reverse. It takes all of the light it can, focuses it into a single long stream of photons, and directs it at a target. So I should be blind. The effect, rather, is of receiving so much visual stimulation that the brain shuts down. Not necessarily bright or burning, just too much. That's comforting. Fade stood, swayed a little on the rocks. Tricky keeping his footing. I'm going to find my daughter and a new phone. When you're done, Eve said, call me. I'll be looking for Lode. Sure. Fade mentally mapped out his route. Behind him, overlooking the lake, sat a wide-ranging outdoor mall. He'd find a phone there, and since credit cards didn't fall apart in the water, several cups of coffee. Then grab a cab back to his car and from there locate JC. Find some way to apologize for disappearing again. And Thalia. He had to check on her too. As a friend and as a father, it hadn't been a good couple of days for him. Eve split away as they entered the mall, vanishing into the crowd of people, taking up positions outside restaurants and perusing sidewalk sales. Fade wandered around until he found a stand selling cheaper phones, looked at the daunting array of devices and decided he needed at least a double espresso to confront that lineup of horrors, came back properly spiked, and proceeded to lose the next 2 hours of his life to buying a phone, turning it on, and getting his old number and contacts restored. He would have rather fought every member of Zero Point's security team. Blindfolded. When he punched in JC's number, the phone rang. Rang again, and then it was picked up. Hello? The voice was not his daughter's, a woman, hard-edged. Who is this? Could ask the same about you? Fade said. Where's JC? The response poured over Fade in the same way that ice water would have, drenching and crushing away all thoughts of anything else. The woman was a detective, and the police had found the phone on the nightstand in an empty hotel room. The chain had been broken, and blood stained the floor next to one of the beds. Security cameras showed a bulky man, dressed like a cowboy, coming and going from the hotel earlier this morning, and neighboring rooms reported hearing gunshots. Any idea who the man might be? I don't, Fade lied, but I'll let you know if I find something. Lode had come for JC and killed her, hidden her body somewhere, all because Fade had gone off like an idiot on his own crusade, all because he'd let Eve keep him off in that place, the Grove, talking to the gardener and the audience. JC had been in trouble, had needed him. He'd let her down. One last time. Mr. Vance, the detective said, we're going to need you to come by the station, ask you some questions. I'll swing by. Fade clicked the phone shut before the detective could reply. Lode. That's the only name he could think of. When his phone buzzed a second later, Fade hoped it was Eve, calling to say she'd found the cowboy bastard. But the number on the other end belonged to Thalia. Hey, Fade picked up. His ears seemed to be ringing, his voice numb and far away. You sound strange. Talia sounded weak too, drugged. The cowboy killed JC, shot her in the hotel last night. What? Fade, where were you? Gone. Tried to find the people that attacked our house. Fade started walking, over towards the taxi stand, to where he could get a car and go. He'd seen where the audience, assuming all of that was real, had pegged Lode's location. He wouldn't wait for Eve. He didn't need her for this. He found her. The police are saying there's a lot of blood. No body. Fade closed his eyes for a second. No body. Yet. Fade, stop. If there's no body, she might still be alive. I don't know that, but I do know he's still out there, Talia, still walking. I'm going to find him. For once, I'm going to be a father. Fade. He hung up, sat on the bench. A taxi would come by soon. In the meantime, he could play through memories, every second with his daughter. He wouldn't forget them, not a single one. This is the end of Rakers Part 4. Keep a lookout for Part 5 soon, and for more adventures, check out blackkeybooks.com. Thanks for listening.